Welcome to this Hey Legal exclusive. Hey Legal exclusive. Content that will keep you up to date and informed about the important legal issues of the day. Time is of the essence, so let's begin.
Well, I'm joined today by Jack Cummins of Hill Brown Licensing. Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to myself and Hey Legal today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, and thanks very much for having me, Ali. It's good to be here.
Brilliant, a pleasure. So we did send over some questions before. You've got an idea of what we might talk about. The first question I propose to put to you, which may cause a laugh, is this the maddest period you have been involved in your career as a licensing lawyer?
Well, yes. Having said that, only by a short head, because when we were converting applications to the new system, the 2005 Act, that was a kind of 18-month process, unforgiving deadlines. A number of licenses were split into tranches, and if you didn't meet the deadline, you lost whatever grandfather rights there were. Right. So there were a lot of sleepless nights then, just because of the pressure and because everyone involved in the system was struggling to understand something that was completely novel. Right. So that was, that was fairly hair-raising. This, I think, is particularly hair-raising because at the moment there isn't any end in sight. Yeah. We wouldn't bet on being out of this by the middle of next year, whereas with previous dramas and licensing, there has always been a light at the end of the tunnel. Good or bad, it was going to finish at a certain time. This, we don't know. Yeah. That uncertainty is a great job. Well, obviously for the trade as well as lawyers are doing their best to advise them. Yeah.
So has it been pretty much 24/7 for you in recent weeks and months then?
There are huge spots of intense activity when regulations come out. Maybe say a wee bit more about that later, but it started off with restrictions, regulations, let's call them that. That was more or less the full lockdown. And we had to get to grips with understanding that. The pattern has been that each iteration of the restrictions, the full lockdown, the 10 p.m. curfew, the circuit breaker, and now where we are at the moment with the level system, that the regulations will always get published at the very last minute. Mm. So, for example, in relation to the levels or system, the regulations extend to 62 pages. That's not all about licensing, but a fair chunk is. And that lands on Friday afternoon. It came into effect this morning, just for the benefit of viewers not watching this on the 2nd of November. We're at the 2nd of November. So you've got to absorb that very, very quickly. I have a great deal of sympathy with the parliamentary draftsmen here. I'm not faulting them or really the Scottish Government for doing that, because if you're drafting something as complex as that, I would imagine that, these guys are working through the night in this, trying to get it done. But it doesn't help when the trade don't know for sure the detail of where they're going to be in a couple of days' time. Obviously, the First Minister's briefings will give a broad idea of what's on the horizon, but the devil, as always, is in the detail. And getting to grips with that detail very, very quickly has produced spells of intense pressure over the past few months.
Yeah. So what are the most pressing issues that you and your clients are facing currently?
I think, there have been so many descriptions from licensed trade leaders about where they are at the moment, cataclysmic situation, existential threat, death by 1,000 cuts. For them, it has really to be about financial viability. The furlough scheme, the job support scheme, and just trying to stay in business. And we're seeing, big number of casualties. I think Pizza Hut in the last few days announced a staggering number of redundancies. Green King the Brewers too. Other people have closed but may not reopen. A couple of months ago, the Scottish Licensed Trade Association prediction was 12,500 job losses across the sector, but that was before the tourniquet was tightened even further on hospitality. So that figure's probably at least double now. So it's all about financial survival. That's the bottom line for them. Can they keep going? It's like, almost like Control-Alt-Delete in the computer. We've got a reset going on here. We don't know what the licensed trade in the hospitality sector is going to look like at the end of the nightmare. At the moment, do you take Christmas party bookings? Well, no, you wouldn't, you know. And you know, it's the constant change and the increasing pressure on ability to be, you know, viable. Yeah.
And I think we've seen now signposting that obviously March has now been looked at as some kind of the next stage to get to, in a way, albeit Christmas arrangements have been talked about, but it's then March. But that's a really significant time frame for a business to be, you know, mothballed or trading in such uncertainty.
Well, indeed, and you know, March. I mean, I've had that as well. But the other problem is that it was something that Jason Leach said recently about these restrictions were to buy time. And by buying time, I think meant getting a vaccine. Now, there are predictions a few weeks ago that there'd be a vaccine in October. I mean, that's just got to be nonsense. No vaccine has ever been developed so quickly before. So if it's a wait for an effective vaccine, plus getting people who might be not keen to take a vaccine that's in a kind of almost a prototype form, it may well be beyond March. I mean, you certainly wouldn't put your money in March.
Absolutely. So, you know, from your perspective, Jack, and from that of your clients, do you feel that the Scottish Government has done a good or a bad job of handling the pandemic?
It's clearly, you know, not just for the Scottish Government, but the governments in the other, Westminster, Northern Ireland and Wales, and throughout Europe, something that is, you know, completely unprecedented. You know, but actually, one thing's back to the time of the Spanish flu, you know, a different world, you know, an entirely different type of society. No lessons really, I think, to be drawn from that. I think that the main area of fault, if I can put it that way, is the way in which the restrictions are communicated to the public. Because, and this was adverted to in the YouTube video that was uploaded yesterday, we've ended up in this ridiculous situation of having the law, sometimes described as rules, and we've got guidance and we've got guidelines, but they're all jumbled up together. I mean, just for example, an Edinburgh newspaper's website says today that if you live in Edinburgh, one of the things you can't do is go to Fife. You can't do it. Fife is in level 2, Edinburgh is in level 3, and the government's advice is that you should not travel between tiers. So, but that's not the law. But it's presented as the law. And I think that's entirely wrong. Even TV news presenters are apt to say you could be fined for breaching the guidelines. Well, no, you can't. And I remember that when earlier in the series of lockdowns, you were advised not to travel more than 5 miles. The First Minister said you shouldn't or you can't travel more than 5 miles. Now, you know, I much prefer law, you know, to guidance. And that conflation is a major irritation. So I think they could have done a lot better than that. I think the other thing is that in terms of producing evidence to justify the level of restrictions in hospitality, what the Scottish Government's put forward is very much, in my opinion, at least less than convincing. This is one of the complaints by the leading trade bodies. In fact, there are 2 strands to the complaint. One, that there hasn't been any parliamentary scrutiny, and that was sort of rectified with the debate at Holyrood last Tuesday. And also that there's been no satisfactory evidence that the restrictions in hospitality are justified. What the Scottish Government did come up with was a paper suggesting that I think between 20 and 26% of people who tested positive for COVID had been in a hospitality setting. Well, I mean, you know, so that's the classic mistake of correlation is not causation. The people who tested positive in a hospitality setting might well have become infected at the hairdressers. They might have become infected in a shop. So that absolutely tells you nothing. There are other figures that cast doubt on the approach. I've regularly seen figures suggesting that that hospitality is only a source of somewhere between 2.6 and 3% of infections. And I'm looking at a pie chart here that I saw yesterday where hospitality, I think, comes in about 2%. Schools and universities, this is as a source of infection, 22%. Care homes, 29%. The workplace, 24%. And other environments, 18%. So, you have a situation where you close down hospitality or put severe restrictions on it and you have universities back. Yeah. And then, surprise, surprise, the cases spike in university cities, particularly Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Dundee. It moved up to tier 3. Aberdeen, I'm not so sure about. So I think that too much blame, if you like, is put in hospitality as a source of infection, particularly since the licensed trade has done absolutely everything it's been asked of them in terms of public health measures, discouraging queuing, face coverings, test and protect data collection system, enhanced hygiene in terms of hand sanitizers, perspex screens. One fairly large pub chain spent £250,000 across a relatively small number of outlets, just putting these measures in place. So, there you are. And also the cafes debacle in the circuit breaker restrictions that have just ended. Licensed cafe, the only licensed premises that could open were licensed cafes. And you had to be sure that you qualified as a cafe, otherwise you get a prohibition notice, effectively a closure order served on you. So we get into a debate about, what's a cafe? And what happens is that people then go to unlicensed cafes that are rammed, to the rafters with very little social distancing, steam in the windows, none of the mitigation measures that you would get. And you ask yourself the question, why is that okay? But people couldn't be in a licensed restaurant that wasn't selling alcohol, that was used to having all these mitigations in place because it was something that they had, something that developed over time. Yeah. So, I think these are legitimate areas for complaint about the way it's been handled.
Yeah, and obviously clarity of messaging is key in terms of taking the public with you. And I think when we're presented with situations where it just seems rather entirely unclear as to why one premise is open and the other one next door isn't. And I had that scenario recently in Prince's Square where I said, well, this place is open, but this place looks pretty much exactly the same, but was closed, which must make it obviously...
The numbers, I think it was just about keeping numbers down. I mean, I can't identify the premises, obviously, but fairly near where I live, there are 2 cafes operating in more or less within about maybe 100 yards of each other in identical styles. They're serving the same kind of food. They've got a takeaway section and they've got a sit-in bit as well. The one that is licensed, although I think I don't act for them, but I think it's a pretty compelling that it was a cafe. The one that is licensed has to close, and the one down the road is able to stay open. But then you pass the one that's been forced to close, that's allowed to do takeaways, and there are people sitting waiting for the takeaway for maybe 10 or 15 minutes while the food is cooked, who might as well have been eating what they could have eaten but for the restriction, and it would come to the same thing. Yeah. But I think it was just about keeping numbers of places down. But of course, what that did, as I said a moment ago, was put pressure in places that were allowed to remain open, and they get stowed out with people who are frankly probably far too close together. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I follow your output on Twitter, and this is perhaps a wider question, Jack, but do you think there's an agenda against alcohol consumption by the Scottish Government generally? And if so, is the pandemic being used to further that agenda?
There is definitely an anti-alcohol agenda. I think that all one can say in relation to the pandemic is that the Scottish Government has been content to stand by and let the trade suffer collateral damage. And having regard to what I said a couple of minutes ago, maybe not on the best of evidence, but over the past few years, there's been a ramping up of, if you like, the war on alcohol. And, you know, it's interesting, the depression of the licensed trade, the number of pubs closing, all that sort of thing, has, over the past few years, been driven by things other than licensing legislation. It's been driven by the smoking ban, you know, and it was driven by the lower drink drive limit. But there are fairly strident anti-alcohol organisations out there who they're using what I think is really known as the Battle Playbook. What you do is you look at the tactics used in the war against cigarette smoking. You realise that these tactics were largely successful, and then you apply them to alcohol. So what happens is that big tobacco becomes big alcohol, you know, and there are calls for warning labels on alcohol products. There are calls for further restrictions and displays. A lot of people would be very happy to see alcohol off display in the way that cigarette displays are now banned, and of course they're behind the familiar grey cabinets. And on the back of this is, you know, lots of research coming out that is designed to show that alcohol is a really dangerous drug. I find that, you know, I find that dispiriting because, just to give you an example, one paper, I think this is 2014, found that there was well, in fact, I use the word advisedly, a correlation between licensed outlet density and health harms. So the more licenses there were in a particular area, the more health harms were to be found. But again, it's correlation and causation. Buried in the report, not mentioned in the executive summary, was a couple of lines that made the whole thing actually pretty worthless, that they couldn't form a causal link between the outlet density and the alcohol harms because more research was needed. But that didn't get the headlines. What got the headlines, on the basis of press releases in the back of the research, was that the more alcohol outlets you have, the more harm results in the general population. Lots of stuff like that. The guidelines, the consumption guidelines were 21 units per week for men, 14 units for women, become 14 units for both sexes. And the chief medical officer in England at the time, and these guidelines are worked out among all the constituent parts of the UK, she said that no amount of alcohol consumption was safe. I mean, that's a remarkably extreme claim to make. This might sound facetious, and it's certainly not meant to be, but apparently eating 2 bacon rolls a week is actually more dangerous than sticking to the alcohol guidelines. Apparently watching television for an hour a day is more dangerous than sticking to the alcohol guidelines. And then you get alcohol is now big tobacco is now big alcohol, the link with cancer. And you see a graphic put up by an alcohol charity on Twitter with a picture of a pint and the legend alcohol is a carcinogen. Well, yes, it is, but there's nothing about relative risks. There's nothing about, the actual amount of danger in drinking alcohol. And I find that annoying because that's just designed to scare people. I think that the chief medical officer was eventually forced to admit that there was actually more danger on a daily basis than getting behind the wheel of a car. It is interesting, is it not, that the result of this pandemic might be the decimation of the licensed trade at a time when alcohol has been very much in the gun sights of government.
Yeah, very much so. And obviously there's this, so in tandem with the pandemic, obviously we're going to have the economic impact, and then people simply not having money as well that they can really spend. Although having said that, massive pent-up desire for people to get out of their houses and and to be able to resume, socialising and whatever. So maybe that will provide some hope. But over the next few weeks, then, what do you see the main developments potentially being?
Just to go back, just to the point that you made there, Ali, and then look at further developments. You talk about people's need to socialise. When the restrictions in place on people socialising in pubs and hospitality venues, people have house parties, you know. And I think the figure I saw recently was that in the course of a month, Police Scotland shut down 3,000 house parties. Now that's only the tip of the iceberg, you know. And that has got to be a major source of infection. And that really doesn't sit with house parties that are really basically beyond enforcement, taking place while people could socialise in a relatively safe environment in pubs. But going forward, I suppose the kind of breaking news today, and it will be subject to much discussion, I'm sure, over the next few days, is the decision in England to go to the full national lockdown as of Thursday. So the question is, what's Scotland going to do? Because it's broadly followed the English model so far, broadly, in an attempt to sort of align Scotland with the rest of the UK. It would be a remarkable thing if the tier system that must have involved tons of miles and putting in place was suddenly abandoned because England was going into a full lockdown. The key decision, I listened to the First Minister's briefing at lunchtime today, the key decision there, or the key factor there, is the availability of furlough scheme funding from the UK Treasury. Yeah. So we know that the furlough scheme has been extended until the end of the English lockdown. And Nicola Sturgeon says that if the furlough is only available in Scotland, while England is in lockdown, the Scottish Government might have to step hard on the brakes. I think that was the expression, with more restrictions to drive the virus down while support is available. So too early to say whether the English change of position is a major game changer for Scotland, but it's certainly got to be something that we'll have to keep an eye on. Yeah.
No, it's a fluid situation, let's put it that way. It's ever changing, and as you say, the whole tier system, which every aspect of that will no doubt have been, as best they can, thought over and suddenly might just be dismantled. But then it brings into into focus the whole issue around being able to finance the measures that each country or government wishes to take. So the move to lockdown in England is a massive factor for Scotland and its hospitality industry, no doubt. So thanks, Jack. But to end on a positive note, as we look to the future, and as Captain Tom, I think, once said, one day this will all be over or whatever. But when it is all over, where will you go for the perfect restriction-free pint or drink?
It's the ice cold and Alex moment, isn't it? Yeah, if you get the reference.
Yeah.
Lots of pubs near where I stay. If I was to pick someone out, that probably wouldn't play well with a lot of clients. So I'll answer that at an angle. I think that the perfect place to be would be at the Markcliffe Hotel in Aberdeen, which is a fantastic wine list. Okay. Having a bottle of Chablis from their seafood menu, and hoping for some weather, which in Aberdeen might be. Yeah, I try to be optimistic. Yeah. I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to taking place before 2022. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we all just have to hope. We will get there. As they say, it will take time. And as long as we can get there without casualties in every respect, then all the better. But listen, thank you so much for providing the insight that you have, Jack. That's fantastic. I'm sure our viewers and listeners will really benefit from hearing what you've got to say. I think it's something that's actually, I bet you never thought licensing law was going to be so of the moment than it is currently. It's a massive topic in everyone's daily discussions. It's just a shame it's got the profile for the reasons that it has. But you're right, we've suddenly become, the licensing laws have suddenly come into their own, but not an enjoyable experience for them or their clients. But that's right.
Okay. Well, listen, Jack, thank you so much again. We will look to publish this as quickly as we can. And I look forward to speaking to you over the next few months, and hopefully we've got more positive things to be discussing.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
We hope this Hey Legal exclusive content has been of value to you. Hey Legal exclusive. Follow us please on YouTube and Twitter, and create a free account on our website to stay informed and entertained about Scottish legal matters as they happen.